Hello everyone, welcome to the start of some Reason 10 tutorials. This is ieolia with ADSR, and today we're going to be talking about the new Reason 10 rack extension, Grain. Grain is one of the new rack extensions that have been natively implemented inside of the new Reason 10 sound content update. Grain, as the name implies, is a granular synthesizer. Grains are small samples of audio, about 1 to 50 milliseconds, and they're made to make a new type of waveform that is unconventional to standard synthesis. So let's take a look at Grain and what it can do. Right here I have the initial preset. It's called Vergon 6. So now we're going to really look at what Grain actually does. So we can see here we actually have a pretty standard view of the sample we have loaded inside of Grain. Up here is a window of how much of the sample we're actually going to be viewing. So we're going to view this, small section we had, the stuff that's relevant to the sound we're playing. We can also come over here and play the original sample so we can hear how it sounds in comparison to our new sound that we've made in Grain. Now, if I actually play this sound back at the E that it's talking about as the root tone, we can hear that the timbre and overall characteristics of the sample have still been vastly maintained inside of the synth. However, the sound that has come out is totally new. So first off, let's talk about how we load our samples in here. We have a few options. Over here, we have this start sampling sound, which when clicked, will actually take your active mic input, which in this case, as we can see, is my microphone that I'm using right now. So I can actually come in here, click it, and start recording my voice right now into the sampler. And then I can click pause when I'm done. And now I've actually recorded my voice into the sampler. I know my voice sounds great, but we're still going to go back to this original sound. I was talking about grains and how they're made up of these very small integers of time in a sample. So let's hear what this sounds like. It might sound familiar to you, and you'll be able to spot granular synthesis whenever heard. We're going to start taking our effects off to make this a little more dry so we can start to hear the raw sound, and then what happens when we start messing around with the grain engines. Okay, here we go. The sample has now been brought back, so it's in its raw state relative to the settings inside of the plugin. So now we're going to come and press our E1, which is our root tone as analyzed by the Grain sampler. So if we press the E, we get our fairly original sound. Though here I believe it sounds a little faster. And right now, you'll notice that I'm actually over here using the tape engine instead of what we were on before, which was the long grains engine. So the tape engine works very similar to how in real life you would have a tape, and the faster you play the tape, the higher in the pitch what's being played will come out, and the slower you play the tape, the slower in pitch what is on the tape will come out. So here, if I play the original, it sounds like that. But if I play an octave down on tape mode, I now have lower pitch because the sample is being played slower. There's an X fade, which has to do with the individual grain sections and how they fade their volume into each other, and that knob is offered right here. But what we are going to look at now is in the grain oscillator, we can actually select like grains, grain lengths, and grain spacings, which as we can see in this audio sample here, will actually show us how many points in the sample it's going to start choosing the grains. Each line is represented as a grain. So now we can make some adjustments here and we can play our original note again. So that's essentially what a grain is. I have made multiple sections of this audio into waveforms and layered them on top of each other and play it at the same time. And we get an interesting sound like this. Up here under the sample options, we have some motion and speed and jitter options here. So if we actually put the speed back up to the original, we have some options for adjusting these sort of grains that we have made. Now, all of these engines do fairly different things. The grain oscillator has a totally unique sound. Long grains, totally unique sound. Spectral grains, totally unique sound. The tape is more or less as like a raw playback, and it works like most standard samplers in this situation. So you could actually use grain to just sample a sound and make very minor non-granular related changes to it. In the long grains, it's going to select a grain. We have the grain length, how long we want the grain to be, as in like milliseconds, like the 1 to 50 I was talking about. And then we have how fast they're going to be played. And again, some crossfades between each grain. Now we can definitely hear some of that sound from the original tone. There's a pan spread knob where we can actually have it fade back and forth between left and right in panning motion. Let's go on to our spectral grain section now, where we can actually have snapping of the harmonics, and we can filter out harmonics, leaving us down to what's left on the MIDI we're actually playing. So this sample, what we could do is have filter out all the harmonics, and we could then snap any of the harmonics, but we don't need to because they're all gone. But if we snap them, we can see what actually happens to all the harmonics here, is they'll come inwards towards the center. What this does is makes the sound entirely root tone. So say we sample a piano chord in here. Obviously, if we play that piano chord on a C, and then put it to an A, we've now lost the key that we've been playing. It no longer fits in the key. And then if we try to play the keys as a chord using that sample chord, we're going to end up now making a dissonant chord because there's just a bunch of notes that don't belong in there. And there's a lot of extra notes as well. So what we could do is we could actually grab the harmonics and snap them back to the center. So that way we hear a lot less dissonance and tones that don't belong in there. It's going to have this sort of sound, and we can hear that this is still moving. So we have some sort of morphing going on here in the spectrum, so the sound is constantly evolving still. In here, we also have a built-in filter, or EQ, as looked at like this. You can do all sorts of cuts if you want to do a low cut like so, and then you can flatten the rest, roll off high ends, boost high ends, make little cuts where you don't want them. It's just like an EQ. You can even have an amount set for how much you want it to affect your sound. If you want to take it off and have it just blank, you can do so. These sounds really do come out like a vocoder in this sense, because it works on this spectral fundamental. When combined with compression, delay, and reverb, the sound is very interesting compared to the original. Some quick things to mention is that there's a oscillator that we can add in. We have a sine, triangle, square, saw, said that backwards, and we have a noise oscillator even, and I guess a more round noise oscillator. We also have a global filter built in here to go with our sampler and our oscillator. We can send it to it, or we can send it around it straight to the amplifier. It's going to go to our filter system, which we have the low pass and the low pass ladder, the band pass, and the high pass. And then after coming through the filter, it will come to the amplifier. Like I said, we can have it skip if we want. In between, we can affect the volume levels of our sample and our oscillator. And there's some gain options for additional amp gain. And then we have velocity on or off to the gain, as we can see by this arrow. And then we have some global panning options. Below here is we have our modulators. So we can go through and select some great presets here for types of waveforms we would like to use in our low frequency oscillations, or if we want to actually make an envelope. This edit Y position is great if you just want to grab a piece of something and lower it, like so. You can it'll grab the nearest point, and you can move over here, click here, and it'll move that nearest point. We have a loop option, so it'll keep looping the envelope, essentially making it an LFO at this point. However, this is an LFO that can now be shaped by hand, which is much different than the LFO in here. That must be a constant. When the loop option is turned off, we have this nice sustain option. Now, basically what will happen is when we play this sound, it'll go, and then stop and stay. Here we have a preset called Please Release Me, and if I press down the key, we can see things are happening after I take my finger off the key. Now, this is because of the sustain. What happens is it stops at the sustain. Up here, we can see this arrow, which indicates where in the sample is playing, and we can see it's moving. This is because the jitter knob is on. If we take the jitter knob off, we'll hear the sound morphs quite pleasantly, and then all of a sudden, we'll just start looping the audio in one place. Now we have looping audio. If we turn on the jitter, you'll recognize that looping sound, but not nearly as unpleasantly as if it was off. You'll also have to know that up here in this playback section, we have the envelope 1 and freeze. Now, these are types of ways that's going to play back the sample. So that was Grain by Propellerhead Instruments. I hope you enjoyed watching and hope you have fun producing your own crazy sounds in Grain. See you next time.